Welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod. Recently, President Trump's ultimatum to Iran has been making headlines. It seems like a war involving Iran is on the horizon, but it's said to have originated from some fateful conflict between Iran and Israel, and that it has its origins in a biblical prophecy. This time I'd like to explore its connection to Ezekiel 38 and 39, which are often cited as part of that prophecy, and the possibility of the war between Iran and Israel backed by the United States, driven by Greater Israel ideology. And before we really get going, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to support the channel.
It's definitely a heavy lineup today.
It really is.
Because, usually when we look at geopolitical flare-ups, we're looking at things like oil prices or trade routes, border disputes. But this specific conflict feels totally different. The people making the decisions aren't just looking at quarterly reports, they're looking at ancient texts.
Yeah, that's exactly the vibe I'm getting. I mean, we turn on the news and you see US B-2 bombers targeting nuclear facilities, rockets raining down on Tel Aviv and Tehran. It feels like the fuse has already been lit.
Oh, absolutely.
But what really caught my eye in the research was the Israeli response codename. Because usually these things are pretty generic, right? Like Operation Desert Storm or Iron Swords.
Right, exactly.
But this one was Kilavi, Operation Rising Lion. That's not just a cool name, is it?
No, it's not. It's a very deliberate signal. Kilavi is a direct quote from the biblical book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 24.
Okay.
The full verse essentially says, "Behold, the people rise up as a lioness, and as a lion lifts himself up."
Numbers 23. That's the story of Balaam, right? The sorcerer who was hired to curse Israel but could only bless them.
You've definitely done your homework.
Yes.
It's a verse about a nation that is completely unstoppable, a nation that won't lie down until it has devoured its prey. And the context here really matters.
How so?
Well, reports indicate that just days before these recent strikes began, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually left a handwritten note with this exact verse at the Western Wall.
Wow. That is a very powerful image.
He really is.
You have a modern secular leader in a suit and tie invoking a 3,000-year-old prophecy right before launching a high-tech air campaign. It frames the war not as a standard security operation, but as a spiritual imperative.
And that framing changes everything. I mean, if you are fighting for security, you can eventually negotiate a ceasefire, right? You establish a border, you sign a treaty.
Right.
But if you're fighting to fulfill a biblical mandate of a lion rising up, the parameters for victory look very, very different. It signals to the entire region that Israel isn't just defending borders anymore. It's asserting a historical and theological destiny.
And it's wild to think about how much things have changed, too. I was looking at the history of Iran and Israel relations for this conversation, and it's almost tragic. Because before the 1979 revolution, under the Shah, they weren't just cordial, they were practically partners.
They were strategic allies.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to imagine now looking at the headlines. But back in the 60s and 70s, Iran was one of Israel's biggest oil suppliers.
Wow.
And Israel, in return, was building infrastructure in Iran. They were helping with agriculture, and they were even collaborating on missile technology.
That is just crazy to think about today.
It is. But you have to remember, they were the two non-Arab powers in the Middle East at the time. They needed each other.
So we went from trading tech and oil to a theology of just total destruction. I want to drill down on the Iranian side of this equation for a second. We hear the death to Israel chants all the time.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people listening, it's easy to dismiss that as just political theater,
Yeah.
Just riling up the base. But the research suggests this is deeply rooted in something called Mahdism.
Yes.
Can we unpack that? Because to the average listener, that might just sound like another generic religious term.
Right. So Mahdism in Shiite Islam revolves around the belief in the 12th Imam, the Mahdi.
Right.
The theological belief is that he went into occultation, basically meaning he went into hiding centuries ago. And the expectation is that he will return at the end of time to rid the world of injustice and establish a global Islamic kingdom.
Okay, so it's a messianic figure.
Exactly.
Which, every major religion has some version of this. Why does that make them so dangerous to Israel specifically?
Because in the specific theological strain that runs the Iranian government right now, the return of the Mahdi isn't just something you sit around and wait for passively.
You have to bring it about.
You have to pave the way for it, yes. And the primary obstacle preventing his return in their worldview is the existence of the Zionist entity, Israel.
So this is the doctrine of annihilation we read about.
Precisely. Supreme Leader Khamenei has explicitly referred to Israel as a cancerous tumor that must be removed. And I want to stress, this isn't just fiery rhetoric for the cameras.
Right.
Remember that statement back in 2015 where he told Israel they literally wouldn't see the next 25 years?
I do remember that.
Or the parliamentary bill titled Iran Responds. They actually set a legislative target date to eliminate Israel by 2041.
That's what scares me. When a government puts an expiration date on another country in a legislative bill, that's not a threat anymore. That's a schedule.
It is a schedule.
And this is where the rational actor theory completely falls apart, doesn't it?
That is the absolute crux of the problem. Think about the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviets didn't blow each other up because of mutually assured destruction, MAD.
Right, because both sides ultimately wanted to survive.
Exactly. Survival was the baseline. But if you're dealing with a leadership that believes their own destruction might actually be the trigger for the Mahdi to return, if they believe that martyrdom is a victory, then how do you deter them?
You can't.
You can't threaten a martyr with death.
It essentially turns geopolitics into a suicide pact.
It really does.
But let's be fair here, because as you pointed out, it's not just Iran operating on a religious map right now. We touched on Operation Rising Lion, but we also need to talk about the Greater Israel ideology.
Yes, we do.
I've seen this term thrown around a lot lately in the news. Is this just about the West Bank and Gaza, or are we talking about something bigger?
It depends on who you ask within the movement, but the maximalist version is really gaining traction. Greater Israel, or Eretz Yisrael HaShalema, is the belief that the Jewish state should encompass the full, original biblical boundaries that were promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15.
And the map for that, I've seen it, it's not small.
Yeah, no, it's massive. It stretches from the river of Egypt, which is often interpreted as the Nile, all the way to the great river, the Euphrates.
And the Euphrates runs through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq.
Exactly. If you look at a modern map, that covers a huge chunk of the entire Middle East. Now, for decades, this was largely a fringe view. It was held by a tiny minority of religious hardliners.
Not anymore.
No. Recently, it has absolutely bled into the mainstream political discourse. You had Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich speaking in Paris at a podium that featured a map of Greater Israel on it. And that map clearly included the entire Kingdom of Jordan.
Oh, I remember the fallout from that.
Yeah.
Jordan was absolutely furious.
Rightfully so. I mean, it's a direct challenge to their sovereignty, to their very existence. And when you have Prime Minister Netanyahu giving interviews like the one he gave in August 2025, stating he is on a spiritual mission attached to this vision, it sets off massive alarm bells.
Places like Riyadh and Cairo.
Exactly. Riyadh, Cairo, Amman. They stop seeing Israel as just a difficult neighbor they can eventually normalize relations with. Instead, they start seeing an expansionist power that is actively driven by scripture.
It's like everyone is reading from totally different scripts, but they're all ending in the exact same war.
That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of scripts, let's talk about the big one. The one that ties all of this modern geopolitical chaos together, Ezekiel 38 and 39, the war of Gog and Magog.
This is the prophecy that comes up every single time there is a flare-up in the Middle East. But I have to admit, the alignment right now is eerily precise.
Let's get into it.
So Ezekiel, writing roughly 2,600 years ago, predicts a massive coalition of nations invading a restored Israel from the uttermost north.
Let's break down that coalition for the listener, because Ezekiel obviously doesn't say Putin or Khamenei. He uses ancient names. So who are the players?
The leader of this coalition is Gog, from the land of Magog. Historically, scholars identified Magog with the Scythians or the various tribes north of the Black Sea. Geographically speaking, if you draw a line directly north of Jerusalem, you hit Moscow. So most modern prophecy watchers identify Magog as Russia.
Okay, so Russia's the head of the snake here. Who else is in the gang?
You have Persia, which is the easiest identification. That's just the ancient name for Iran.
Right.
Then you have Kush, which is modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
You have Put, which is Libya. And then you have Gomer and Beth Togarmah.
Gomer and Beth Togarmah.
Nope.
Those are usually associated with Turkey, right?
Correct.
See, this is where I always get stuck when reading about this. Because Turkey is a NATO member.
Yes.
They are technically allies of the West. How does a prophecy written 2,600 years ago account for a NATO ally turning on Israel and joining forces with Russia?
That is the fascinating part. For decades, Bible scholars really scratched their heads at that one, because during the Cold War and into the 90s, Turkey was staunchly secular and pro-Western. But look at the last 10 years. Under Erdogan and the current leadership, Turkey has pivoted hard away from the West. They've become increasingly hostile to Israel, and they've been cozying up to Russia and Iran. The recent geopolitical shift matches the ancient text perfectly.
It's definitely converging.
Yeah.
But let's look at the motive. Why invade? The text says they come to seize plunder and capture spoil. Is Russia coming for the hummus? I mean, what is the spoil here?
This is where the imagery of the hooks in the jaws comes in. The prophecy specifically describes God putting hooks in the jaws of Gog and dragging him into this battle.
Meaning he doesn't want to go?
It implies reluctance. Like, he doesn't necessarily want to start this specific fight, but he desperately needs something he's pulled in.
And that something is likely energy.
Exactly. For years, people wondered what tiny Israel could possibly have that a massive country like Russia would want or need. But then Israel discovered massive offshore natural gas fields.
The Leviathan and Tamar fields.
Right. And overnight, Israel is positioned to be a major energy supplier to Europe.
Which cuts directly into Russia's entire business model.
Exactly.
Because Russia's leverage over Europe completely depends on them being the sole gas tap. If Israel can supply Europe via the Mediterranean, Russia loses its grip.
That is a massive economic hook. You combine that with Russia's current reliance on Iranian drones and military tech for their other conflicts, and you can see how Putin or Gog could be dragged into a war he doesn't really want, simply to secure his own economic survival and satisfy his allies.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have the invaders clearly lined up. What about the good guys? Because usually if Russia and Iran try to wipe out Israel, you'd expect the U.S. Navy to park an aircraft carrier off the coast and just say, not today. Does Ezekiel mention the Americans?
This is the part of the text that really worries American listeners, because the prophecy does mention a group that protests the invasion, but they don't actually step in to stop it.
Protests, but doesn't fight.
Right. It calls them Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish with all their young lions.
Okay, let's decode that. Who are Sheba and Dedan?
Most scholars agree that refers to the Arabian Peninsula, so Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Which makes total sense today, because they are terrified of Iran and are tacitly aligned with Israel and the West.
And the merchants of Tarshish.
Tarshish was a distant maritime trading power to the far west of ancient Israel. Historically, it's often linked to Spain or Britain, and by extension, the young lions are viewed as the powerful colonies that came from that power.
Meaning the United States, Canada, Australia.
Exactly. The Western powers.
So the prophecy essentially predicts that the U.S., the U.K., and Saudi Arabia are just sitting on the sidelines.
They file a diplomatic complaint. The text says they ask the invaders, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty?
They just ask a rhetorical question.
Yes. They don't send the Marines. They don't launch the nukes. They just watch and protest.
That is chilling. I mean, it implies either a total loss of political will or that the U.S. is so distracted by domestic issues or weakened globally that it literally can't intervene.
Right.
But if Israel is left entirely alone against Russia, Iran, Turkey, and half of North Africa, that's not a war. That's a massacre. How does the prophecy say they survive?
It's not the Iron Dome, and it's not the Mossad. Ezekiel describes a massive supernatural intervention.
Okay.
It says there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so violent that the mountains are thrown down and the walls fall. It speaks of pestilence and bloodshed and overflowing rain, hailstones, fire, and brimstone.
Fire and brimstone. So we were talking Old Testament, literal divine judgment.
Total devastation. The text says the invading armies are thrown into such panic and confusion that they actually turn their swords against each other. It says it will take the house of Israel 7 months just to bury the dead and clean the land.
7 months.
Yes. It is described as the definitive moment God steps out from behind the curtain to show the world that he is real.
Which really brings us back to the U.S. political scene, because we can't ignore the fact that a huge chunk of the American electorate actually wants this to happen.
Right. And this is where we have to talk about Christian Zionism and dispensationalism.
Yes.
Millions of evangelical Christians in the U.S., including some very key figures in government, view these prophecies not as scary warnings to be avoided, but as a mandatory checklist.
Because they believe this war has to happen for the second coming.
Right. Yes. In their specific theology, the gathering of the Jewish people in Israel, the escalating conflict with the North, the ultimate war of Gog and Magog, these are all absolute prerequisites for the end times and the return of Jesus.
So if you are a policymaker in Washington who genuinely believes that, you aren't trying to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East.
No.
You might actually be cheering it on behind closed doors.
That is the self-fulfilling prophecy argument that a lot of critics point out. If you support Israel primarily because you believe they need to be positioned there for Armageddon, your foreign policy is going to look very, very different than if you're just trying to keep global oil prices stable. You have people looking at the Russian-Iranian alliance right now and thinking, great, the stage is finally set, let's get this over with.
It is the ultimate convergence of events. Think about it. We have the military alignment on the ground, perfectly matching the ancient geography. We have the economic incentive with the massive gas fields acting as the hooks in the jaws. We have the diplomatic alignment where the Gulf states Sheba and Dedan are siding with the West against Iran.
And we have the ideological drivers pushing everyone forward. The Iranians are actively waiting for the Mahdi. The Israeli hardliners are mapping out the borders of Greater Israel. And the American evangelicals are watching the skies for the rapture.
Everyone is playing their part in a script that was written millennia ago.
They really are.
It really makes you wonder about free will and geopolitics. Like, are these leaders making rational, strategic choices based on current events, or are they just actors hitting their marks on a stage?
That is the ultimate question for you to ponder, because to a secular analyst, this is all just a series of unfortunate, albeit predictable, escalations over resources and borders.
Sure.
But to the people actually holding the nuclear codes in Tehran, or the people drawing up the planning maps in Jerusalem, this is destiny. And that makes the current situation incredibly volatile.
Because you can negotiate over territory.
Exactly. You can negotiate over territory. You cannot negotiate over destiny.
Man. Whether you believe Ezekiel literally saw this in a divine vision, or whether we are just watching history rhyme in the most terrifying way possible, the stakes couldn't be higher. We are watching a conflict where the ultimate goal isn't just winning a conventional war, it's ushering in a completely new age for humanity.
And historically speaking, those are the types of wars that leave the deepest, most permanent scars on the world.
Something to really think about as these headlines keep rolling in. Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod. Please order the book from the link below.